Air Canada Flight 143 makes an unscheduled stop in an unusual way on this episode of the Taking Off podcast. Welcome to the Taking Off podcast. I'm Dan Milliken.
And I'm Cozy Christy Wong.
Cozy, yes. So I'll tell you, the building management here at the studios has been keeping it really, really cold over on our side of the building.
Yeah, and I dressed for it to be 109 degrees Fahrenheit outside.
Which it is outside.
Yes.
And yeah, that's why I carry a blanket in my office, because it is cold here.
So for those of you watching the podcast on YouTube, you are going to notice that I am very bundled up because I'm wearing shorts and a tank top.
Yes.
And it's like 55 degrees in here.
It is cold. It is cold. Well, Christy, today we're talking about the famous Gimli Glider. And this story, while not the longest glide of an airliner, was certainly one of the most publicized because of all the different factors. And just real quick, tell us the facts about this, the who, what, where, when.
Yeah, so this particular airplane was piloted by a two-man flight crew. It was Captain Bob Pearson, and I believe the first officer was Marcus Quintal?
Quintal or Quintal? I'm not sure how you pronounce it. And it's a 767.
Yeah, they were an experienced flight crew, very professional. The day before, the airplane had gone through some weird maintenance hiccups with the way that the flight management system was recording the fuel.
Yeah.
And so maintenance had come out. They had done their maintenance thing, released it back to service, and it actually did a flight that day before with no issues. Well, the day that this incident happened, which was in July of 1983.
I had just graduated high school.
It was just before my first birthday.
Don't say that. Holy cow.
Right, I'm sorry. So just facts, Dan. But they were getting ready to do their flight. The flight was Montreal to Edmonton. Yeah, Edmonton.
Not very far.
No, not super far.
For 41,000 feet was their altitude. That just seems high.
I mean, they'll send us up as high as possible. It's all about fuel savings, and it depends on where you can catch the winds. There's a lot of factors there. But for example, side note, but they'll file us far away sometimes, but file us at 250 because, which is 25,000 feet, because that's where the best winds are. That's it. We might have 100 knot tailwinds, versus going up high and have headwinds or something. But either way, this is what they were filed for. And there was a lot of back and forth going on. And there was another maintenance technician that came out. And the first link in the chain with this particular incident was that they had a backup. What did they call it? It was the
FQIS.
Yeah, FQIS.
The fuel quantity indicator sensor.
There you go. Yeah. He disengaged the wrong sensor, from my understanding.
He is who? The captain or the first officer?
No. The maintenance technician.
Maintenance technician.
Yeah. He came out, did something because they had a backup one. Well, he disengaged the wrong one. And so that was the first link in the chain. The next link was that because of that, they actually had to use a dipstick effectively.
An actual dipstick into the wing tank.
Right. Basically to measure the fuel. So they normally in the airlines or in jets in general, instead of gallons which is a volume measurement that we use here in the States, we use pounds.
Weight.
Which is weight. So, or a more scientific term for that would be mass. Right. So they take it from volume to mass. And so in this case, they said, okay, well, we need to take it from, liters, and they had to interpret it into kilograms or whatever.
Or vice versa, yeah.
Right. And so they miscalculated it.
Liters to kilograms.
Yeah. You take it from volume to mass. And so they were taking it from that volume to weight. They miscalculated it. So and then they programmed it into the FMS, the flight management system.
And who they this time is?
The flight crew.
So the pilot, the captain, and the first officer.
Correct. So they thought they had more than enough fuel to make this flight, but they had less than half the required amount.
45%.
Yeah, exactly. It was, I couldn't remember the exact
Yeah.
number, but I know they had less than half. And so problems ensued as they were in the air. And that's where the fun starts happening, because they start, they flame out, basically.
Wow.
And they go, okay, what are we going to do? They started getting, you know, the alarms and everything else going off, and they completely flamed out. So I believe they deployed the RAT, which is the ram air turbine, which is like a little mini like windmill that'll pop out automatically if you lose electrical power. And that provides enough electrical power to power your like emergency systems. So you'll have radio and very limited flight controls, and you're not supposed to deploy the flaps past a certain amount, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But it gives you just enough electricity to power your emergency functions.
Right. And a note, this was actually, the 767 was one of the first to include like an electronic flight system anyway. So this was a new kind of thing in 1983.
Right. With this Boeing 767, you know, this was like revolutionary stuff at the time. So they realize that they are in a real pickle. And they need to figure out where they're going to land this airplane, because they're clearly not going to make it to Edmonton.
Well, yeah, both engines flame out. And so they grabbed the checklist for 2 engine out.
Right. I don't think they realized that they ran out of fuel just yet.
Well, I do know that I was saying that almost tongue in cheek. There were, when they reached for the emergency checklist, there were no 2 engine out checklist.
Yeah, that's true.
That was one of the
Okay.
problems they had. Is like, holy cow, there is no checklist for this emergency.
Right. So, for example, you and I being GA pilots, and we fly single engine aircraft as well as multi-engine aircraft. But in a single engine aircraft, if you lose your engine, well, that's your one and only. So we kind of go through the ABC, right?
Right.
Airspeed, best place to land, checklist if possible. And so that's kind of, I think, Captain Pearson kind of went into GA mode, because what a lot of people didn't, or I guess people didn't realize at the time or whatever, he was an experienced glider pilot. So
Right.
he had a lot of which is just insane that he was the one piloting this airplane on this day, because he pulled out a lot of glider aerodynamic tricks out of his tool chest and applied it toward the situation at hand. He actually pitched the airplane basically for best glide and was gliding it in.
There wasn't a best glide. He had to guess.
Right.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so he picked 220 knots.
Right.
And meanwhile, the first officer is trying to calculate can they make Winnipeg? That was what their initial thoughts were.
And then they realized they probably weren't going to be able to make Winnipeg, but they were flying over another field that the first officer was familiar with, because he was
a former field.
Well, we'll get to that in a second.
But didn't he know that it was former? I think they did know it was closed down. It was a former
Royal Canadian Air Force.
Yeah, and
it was like Gimli Field or whatever.
Gimli Station.
Gimli Station, okay.
The RCAF Station Gimli, a closed Air Force base. So it was an Air Force base that the first officer had flown out of years before, but it was known to be closed.
Okay, so they just figured, okay, well, we've got a runway.
We got a runway.
We're good to go. So they start getting in, and the captain realizes, well, at this point now they're too high, right? So he does one of the most baller things I've heard of in a situation. He forward slips a freaking jet. And normally you would not slip a jet. Like, people have asked me, oh, can you slip the jet like if you're too high? Not really, because you need airflow going into the engines. Well,
you don't have any engines.
Fortunately for them, they had a double flame out because they lost, so they lost both engines, and so he was able to slip it in, and he knew this maneuver very well, having been a glider pilot. Being a glider pilot, sometimes you got to slip it in. So he does that, and as they get down, they realize kind of at the last second, this closed runway that they thought they were going to have was full of people. It had been.
And hold that thought for because that's the big thing. But going back to the whole thing about slipping, one of the reasons why is because they could not extend slats or flaps.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because they had lost all their power. And that's kind of why I said before, you can't, even with the rat deployed, you can't extend past a certain point. In fact, in order to keep the rat going, you have to keep your airspeed at a particular.
And when you said that, I was thinking, well, just do a 360. But they actually looked at that and didn't feel they had enough altitude to complete that maneuver.
It's a tricky thing. They were too high, but they weren't high enough to be able to execute that 360. So in Captain Pearson's mind, he said, well, let's just slip it. So they did.
So then Gimli Airfield, the closed station, wasn't quite closed, was it?
It wasn't closed. It was full of people that day. It had been turned into like a motor sports complex or something.
Half of it, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And they had actually, over the main runway, had built a guardrail or rail for drag races.
Right.
And so there was, they had that built up on the runway. But neither the pilots or ATC knew about that.
Right. At the time, they thought it was a good idea.
Right.
Like, oh, great. How fortunate for us. So, but as they get down, they start seeing stuff on the ground and they're like, oh man, now we're in an even bigger pickle.
Yeah. So then what happened?
So they get in, as they get in, they're like, we're just going to have to land it. Like they had no other option at that point.
Well, talk about the gear.
So,
now, if they can't extend slats and flaps, how are they going to extend gear?
You can extend, there's an emergency gear release.
And it's gravity fed.
Right, exactly. So basically you just dump any of the hydraulic pressure that's holding the gear up, you dump it and it just kind of free falls in. So I'm trying to remember what happened with the gear.
Well, okay, so the front gear didn't lock.
Right,
the
that's
mains did.
The mains did.
And the fact that the front gear didn't lock actually saved a lot of people.
Yes, that's right. Yep. Because I remember, I couldn't remember why, but I remember the nose gear collapsing.
Yes.
But the main gear
added
was fine.
friction enabled them to stop sooner.
Correct.
And not run into the...
Right.
And also no engine, so this plane was silent. It was a glider.
Right. And
so nobody saw it coming.
Nobody has thought to equip the 767 with a horn yet.
Yeah, right.
So there was really no way. So, I mean, really... It wound up being like people looked up and saw this giant airliner coming into land and they skedaddled out of there. So yeah, they land, the nose wheel collapses and then they slide in and nobody died. I don't even think there were really any major injuries or anything like that.
No, the only injuries were with the nose wheel collapse, the tail was sticking up high. And so people that
had to get out
disembarked from the back came down a little bit fast, and so there were a few minor injuries that way. But the racers and the people on the ground quickly extinguished the little bit of fire that was in the nose gear from that collapse, that friction.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, that's a basic overview of what happened in this case. I just thought it was really cool that Captain Pearson had been in like this glider pilot and effectively knew what to do. And I can say that now, having been an airline pilot for a couple of years, when you don't stay proficient with hand flying, either in GA or gliders or whatever else, you start to kind of lose that.
Yeah. This guy was a real true pilot. He wasn't just a button pusher or somebody who just... you take off and then immediately hit autopilot. The guy knew stick and rudder. Right,
exactly. He was a very stick and rudder pilot. And I just feel that in this case, it was so fortunate that he was he was also part of the problem.
Well,
but he was a huge part of the solution in that he was the one. I mean, it could have happened to anybody.
The Canada Safety Board really pointed a lot of fingers at Air Canada for their maintenance and everything else. And they actually, in the report, praised the pilots for their decision-making and their flying skills.
Right. I mean, here's the thing, you guys, is so I've got Recurrent this month, Recurrent Training. Airline pilots, depending on what airline you're at, typically you have to go to a Recurrent Training once a year, okay? For some airlines, it's more. And I made a post on my social media You can follow me on Instagram at Pilot Christy. I made a post saying, like, oh, it's that time of the year again. It's recurrent time, just kind of throwing it out there for people. So if you've noticed I've been absent lately, this is why. Well, on my Facebook page, I had some people kind of razzing me like, oh, did you forget where the buttons were and whatever? And
oh, my goodness.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, it's not about that. It's when you go through recurrent training, you're not just doing normal takeoffs and normal landings, because we do that all the time. You're doing emergency procedures that we don't get to practice. These non-normal procedures, those are the ones that throw us off. And for them to have to calculate the fuel the way that they did and go through those procedures, that was a very non-normal procedure. That's not something that they do on a daily basis. So I honestly don't fault them in that situation because it was so far off from their daily, regime. They messed up,
They did. And what's interesting here is the pilots messed up, but they were also praised. And at the end of the day, the captain was demoted for 6 months.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And the first officer was suspended for 2 weeks. And then 3 maintenance workers were also suspended. But in 1985, both the captain and the first officer were awarded the first ever Fédération Aéronautique International diploma. So they're given a medal for outstanding airmanship. So there is that.
I feel, though, in this case, I feel like the punishment fits the crime. I mean, there was definitely, like I said, they should have done better. At the end of the day, it was still their job. Even in a non-normal situation, you still need to know.
I think if people had died, this would have been a totally different conversation. Right. Because I think back, I worked with my son in a Boy Scout-like organization as he was growing up, and they have a life-saving merit. But one of the things about the life-saving merit, you cannot earn the life-saving merit if you're the one that caused the fire, as it were. So, it's kind of interesting that the captain and first officer do get a medal for causing the problem that they had, but it's not like they were the main cause of the problem.
Right.
They contributed. They were a link in the chain. They weren't the main cause.
Captain Pearson, is he still alive?
I don't know if he's still alive, but no, the first officer died in 2015.
Okay. So Maurice. It wasn't Marcus. It was Maurice Quintel.
Quintel. So what's interesting? This was only like the 47th 767 out of the gate.
Right. It was like new.
Yeah. Well, the 767's first deal was 1981, so it was 2 years before.
Yeah.
So very new airplane, and they repaired this, and it stayed on the line. The Gimli Glider stayed flying for another 20 years, no, more than 20 years.
Right. So I just have a weird obsession. A lot of people know that I like nav aids and things like that, and I like, I want to go see. I wanted to go see the Gimli Glider, and then I looked it up and saw that sadly they sold it, and then it sat, I think, in the desert for a while, and then they scrapped it.
That's horrible. Yeah, it was at the Mojave Desert.
Yeah, they scrapped the Gimli Glider, and
that's too. That plane needed to be in.
Yeah, and they apparently made some of those plane tags out of them, but I could never find any. I just thought it would be really cool.
Like our friend Jimmy from Jimmy's World with Elvis's plane.
Right, exactly. But so sadly, the Gimli Glider flies no more, but it's also, I'm that person that would have gone to the desert to go see it.
I would have gone.
Yeah, there it is, but it's not there.
All right, so that's the story about the Gimli Glider, and just amazing that nobody was hurt. That nobody died. It's an amazing story all the way around. 1983. What are we, 40 years ago now?
Yeah, don't remind me.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, it was good talking about it. And for you guys listening, thanks for listening to our Taking Off podcast. Don't forget our sponsors, Flying Eyes. Use our discount code Taking Off, all caps, one word, 10% off at flyingeyesoptics.com. Also, the best camera mounts and iPhone mounts for your plane. You can also use them for your car. That's actually where they've kind of made their mark, is 67 Design, 67D.com. And ClemensInsurance.net. Jerry has saved me a ton of money. So if you need any kind of insurance, check Jerry out. He will help you. Z Vision, the brightest landing and taxi lights out there. Marshall Protective Services, mpsprotects.com. Colton Mortgage for your residential mortgage needs, coltontakingoff.com. Our sponsors really make this happen. So if you guys can support them, it absolutely supports us. So, Christy?
Final thought. I actually just read that they had a final appeal, or a successful appeal, to their suspensions. So
really?
Yeah, so their suspensions were overturned. I just read that.
Years later? While they were serving their suspension?
It said that the aircraft was temporarily repaired at Gimli and flew out 2 days later to be fully repaired at a maintenance base in Winnipeg. Following the full repair, the aircraft was returned to service with Air Canada. Following a successful appeal against their suspensions, Pearson and Quintal were assigned as crew members aboard another Air Canada flight.
Awesome. So good to see that, their contribution didn't hurt their careers.
Yeah, exactly.
And their incredible flying skills is an inspiration to pilots everywhere.
Absolutely.
All right, you guys, thanks for listening. And we'll talk to you next time on the Taking Off podcast.